The old bus wheezed to a stop at the corner of Maple Street, and 12-year-old David stepped off with his mother. The morning air was crisp, and he could see his breath forming small clouds as he looked around the neighborhood. Everything here was different from where they lived. The houses were huge, with perfectly trimmed lawns and fancy cars parked in circular driveways. Even the sidewalks looked cleaner somehow. "Stay close, baby," his mother whispered, adjusting the strap of her worn canvas bag. She had been nervous all morning, checking her reflection in their cracked bathroom mirror at least 10 times before they left their small apartment. This was her first day working for the Richardson family, and she couldn't afford to mess it up. Jobs like this didn't come around often, especially ones that paid well enough to help catch up on the rent. David watched his mother smooth down her uniform one more time. She always did that when she was worried. He wanted to tell her she looked fine, that she was the hardest working person he knew, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently as they walked up the long, winding driveway toward the mansion. The house was like something out of a movie. 3 stories tall with white columns and massive windows that sparkled in the morning sun. David had never seen a house with so many windows, and he wondered what it would be like to live in a place where you could see the sky from every room. Their apartment only had 2 small windows, and one of them faced a brick wall. Mrs. Richardson answered the door herself, which surprised David's mother. She had expected a butler or a maid like in the movies, but here was this elegant woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "You must be Linda," Mrs. Richardson said warmly, extending her hand. "And this must be David. Welcome to our home." David's mother shook hands carefully, still nervous. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Mrs. Richardson. I promise I'll work hard." "I'm sure you will. Now let me show you around so you can get familiar with everything." Mrs. Richardson led them inside, and David's eyes went wide. The ceiling in the entrance hall had to be 20 feet high, with a crystal chandelier hanging down like something from a fairy tale. The floors were made of marble that reflected their footsteps, and there were paintings on the walls that looked like they belonged in a museum. As his mother received her tour of the kitchen and laundry areas, David found himself wandering. Mrs. Richardson had told him he was welcome to explore the main floor while his mother got settled, as long as he was careful and didn't touch anything valuable. He nodded seriously, understanding the weight of that trust. The house seemed to go on forever. There was a dining room with a table that could seat 20 people, a library with books from floor to ceiling, and a living room with furniture that looked like it had never been sat on. Everything was perfect, like a display in a fancy store. David wondered if the Richardson family ever really lived here or if they just visited sometimes. But then he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. Music. Soft and beautiful, floating through the air like nothing he'd ever heard before. He followed the sound down a hallway lined with family photographs, past a grandfather clock that chimed softly as he walked by. The music was coming from behind a set of double doors that were slightly open. David peeked inside and gasped. The room was flooded with natural light from tall windows, and in the center sat the most beautiful piano he had ever seen. It was black and glossy, so polished that he could see his reflection in its surface. The music wasn't being played by anyone, though. It was coming from a small speaker system, probably left on from the night before. David had been drawn to music for as long as he could remember. When he was little, he would bang on pots and pans in their kitchen, driving his mother crazy but creating rhythms that somehow made sense to him. At school, he always volunteered to help the music teacher set up for assemblies, just so he could be near the instruments. And at the community center, there was an old electric keyboard that barely worked, but David had taught himself to play simple songs on it during the after-school program. But this piano was something else entirely. It was a grand piano, the kind he had only seen on television or in movies. The keys looked like perfect teeth, white and gleaming, with the black keys standing out like elegant accents. David wondered what it would sound like, what it would feel like to press those keys and create real music, not the tinny electronic sounds from the community center keyboard. He took a step into the room, then another. The carpet was so thick and soft that his footsteps made no sound. He approached the piano slowly, almost reverently, like he was in a church. The closer he got, the more details he could see. The wood grain in the piano surface, the gold lettering that spelled out Steinway & Sons, the music stand that held sheets of complex-looking compositions. David had never seen sheet music like this before. At the community center, they had books with simple songs and big notes, but these sheets were covered with tiny black marks that looked like a secret code. He wondered what stories they told, what emotions they held, what magic they could create when someone who knew how to read them sat down to play. Without really thinking about it, he reached out and gently touched one of the white keys. The sound that came out was pure and clear, nothing like the electronic beeps he was used to. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment before fading away, leaving him wanting to hear more. He pressed another key, then another. Each note was perfect, rich, and full of possibility. He wasn't playing a song, just exploring the sounds, but even those simple notes seemed to fill the room with something beautiful. For a moment, David forgot where he was, forgot that he didn't belong in this world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. All that mattered was the music and the way it made him feel inside. The community center keyboard had taught him the basics. He knew which keys made which sounds, and he had figured out how to play a few simple melodies by ear. But this piano responded to his touch in a way that old keyboard never could. When he pressed softly, the sound was gentle and sweet. When he pressed harder, it was bold and strong. It was like the piano was alive, waiting to tell whatever story he wanted to share. David closed his eyes and let his fingers find a simple melody he had been working on at the community center. It was something he had made up himself, thinking about what it might feel like to fly above the city and see everything from up high. On the old keyboard, it had sounded okay, but here on this magnificent instrument, it sounded like real music. It sounded like it meant something. He was so lost in the moment that he didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway or notice the shadow that had appeared in the doorway. All he knew was the music and the incredible feeling of creating something beautiful in this perfect room, filled with golden morning light. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice cut through the music like a knife, and David's fingers froze on the piano keys. His heart jumped into his throat as he spun around to see a boy about his age standing in the doorway. This had to be the Richardson's son, Christopher. He was tall and pale, with perfectly combed blonde hair and clothes that probably cost more than David's mother made in a month. But it was his expression that made David's stomach drop. Pure anger mixed with disgust, like he had just discovered something truly offensive. I was just... David stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He quickly pulled his hands away from the piano keys and took a step back. But Christopher was already striding into the room with purpose. "Just what? Just touching our piano with your dirty hands?" Christopher's voice was getting louder, and David could see two other boys appearing behind him in the doorway. They must have been friends visiting for the weekend, and they were looking at the scene with the same mixture of shock and disdain as Christopher. David looked down at his hands automatically. They weren't dirty. His mother had made sure he washed them thoroughly before they left the apartment, and she had checked his fingernails twice. But under Christopher's glare, he suddenly felt like maybe they were dirty. Maybe everything about him was wrong for this perfect room. "Do you have any idea how much this piano costs?" Christopher continued, moving closer. "It's worth more than your entire neighborhood, probably. And here you are, just touching it like it's some toy." One of Christopher's friends, a stocky boy with red hair and freckles, laughed mockingly. "Look at his clothes," he said, pointing at David's worn jeans and hand-me-down shirt. "I bet he's never even seen a real piano before. Probably thinks it's some kind of fancy computer or something." The third boy, thin with dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses, joined in. "My dad says people like them don't understand real music anyway. They probably only listen to that loud stuff on the radio." David felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger. He wanted to tell them they were wrong, that he loved all kinds of music that he had been teaching himself to play for years. He wanted to explain about the community center keyboard and the melodies he created in his head when he walked to school. But the words stuck in his throat, and all he could do was stand there while the three boys circled him like predators. Stronger than he felt. "I was just listening to it." "Listening?" Christopher laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "You were playing it. I heard you from upstairs. What gave you the right to play our piano?" "Nothing," David admitted quietly. I love music." This seemed to make Christopher even angrier. "You love music? What would you know about music? Real music takes years of lessons and practice. It takes education and culture. It's not something you can just pick up off the street." The red-haired boy nodded eagerly. Christopher's been taking lessons since he was 5. He's performed at the country club and everything. He understands classical music. David looked at Christopher with new interest despite his fear. You play piano too? Of course I play, Christopher snapped. I've been playing for 8 years. I can read music, I know theory. I've studied with the best teachers money can buy. What I don't do is sneak into other people's houses and put my grubby fingers all over their expensive instruments. I didn't sneak in, David said, finding his voice again. Your mother said I could look around. She was showing my mom around the house for her new job. Oh, so you're the cleaning lady's kid, the thin boy with glasses said, like he had just solved a puzzle. That explains everything. I wondered what you were doing in here. Your mom's the new maid? Christopher asked, and something in his tone made David's skin crawl. Well, that explains why you think you can just touch whatever you want. I guess nobody taught you about boundaries. David felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. These boys didn't know anything about him or his mother. They didn't know how hard she worked, how she stayed up late studying for her GED, how she saved every penny so they could move to a better neighborhood someday. They didn't know that she was the strongest person he had ever met. My mother works hard, David said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She's not just a cleaning lady. She's smart and kind and she takes care of people. Christopher rolled his eyes. I'm sure she's very nice. But that doesn't give you the right to come into our music room and play our piano like you own the place. This isn't a playground. I know it's not a playground, David shot back. I know it's special. That's why I was being careful. Careful? The red-haired boy laughed. You call that careful? Do you know how sensitive piano keys are? Do you know about the oils from your skin getting on them? My piano teacher says you should always wash your hands before playing, and that's just for practice pianos. This is a concert grand. David looked back at the beautiful instrument, and for a moment he saw it through their eyes. Maybe he had been wrong to touch it. Maybe he didn't understand how delicate and expensive it was. But then he remembered the sound it had made, the way the notes had filled the room with something magical, and he couldn't bring himself to regret it completely. It sounded beautiful, he said quietly. What did you say? Christopher asked, stepping closer. The piano. It sounded beautiful when I played it. More beautiful than anything I've ever heard. Christopher's face twisted with something that might have been jealousy mixed with anger. You think you made it sound beautiful? You don't even know what you were doing. You were just banging on keys randomly. It wasn't random, David said, his voice getting stronger. It was a song I wrote. All 3 boys stared at him for a moment, then burst into laughter. It was the kind of laughter that cut deep, the kind that made David feel small and stupid and wrong. You wrote a song? Christopher gasped between laughs. Oh, that's rich. What did you call it? Ode to a Mop Bucket? The other boys laughed even harder at this, and David felt his face burning again. But underneath the embarrassment was something else, something that felt like determination. I write lots of songs, he said quietly. I play them at the community center. The community center, the thin boy repeated mockingly. Oh, I'm sure that's where all the great musicians get their start. Right next to the food pantry and the used clothing donations. David wanted to tell them that the community center was a good place, that Mrs. Johnson, who ran the music program there, was kind and encouraging, that she had told him he had real talent. But he could see from their faces that nothing he said would matter. They had already decided who he was and what he was worth. Christopher moved to the piano and ran his hand possessively along its edge. This piano has been played by real musicians. Concert pianists have performed on it at parties here. My great-grandmother was a professional pianist, and this was her piano. It's been in our family for 3 generations. He turned back to David with a cold smile. So you can understand why we don't want just anyone putting their hands on it. It's not that we're mean or anything. It's just that some things are special, and they should be treated with respect by people who understand their value. David nodded slowly, understanding the message perfectly. He wasn't the right kind of person to touch this piano. He didn't have the right background, the right clothes, the right education. He was just the cleaning lady's kid, and he should remember his place. But as he looked at the piano one more time, he couldn't shake the memory of how it had felt to create music on it, even for just a few moments. It had felt right in a way that nothing else in his life ever had. And deep down, in a place the boy's cruel words couldn't reach, he knew that music didn't care about money or fancy clothes or family history. Music just cared about truth. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made all four boys turn toward the door. David's heart sank, thinking it might be his mother coming to find him. The last thing he wanted was for her to see him being humiliated like this on her first day at work. But instead of his mother, an elderly woman appeared in the doorway. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant twist and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple but expensive-looking dress in navy blue, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of being listened to and respected. This had to be Mrs. Richardson's mother, Christopher's grandmother. "What's all this noise about?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I could hear shouting from the garden room. Christopher immediately straightened up, his whole demeanor changing. "Oh, hi, Grandma Rose. We caught this kid playing your piano without permission." I was explaining to him why that's not appropriate. Grandma Rose's eyes moved from Christopher to his friends, then settled on David. Her gaze was intense but not unkind, like she was solving a puzzle in her head. David found himself standing straighter under her scrutiny, even though he felt like shrinking into the floor. "Is that so?" she said slowly. "And who might you be, young man?" "His name is David," Christopher answered quickly. "He's the cleaning lady's son. Mom said he could look around, but I don't think she meant he could play the piano." "I see." Grandma Rose stepped further into the room, her eyes never leaving David's face. "And were you indeed playing the piano, David?" David nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause trouble." She moved closer to the piano, running her hand along its surface the same way Christopher had. But somehow when she did it, it looked like a greeting between old friends rather than a possessive gesture. "This piano has quite a history, you know. It belonged to my mother before me and her mother before that. It's been played by some remarkable musicians over the years." Christopher nodded eagerly. "That's exactly what I was telling him, Grandma Rose. It's too special for just anyone to play." But his grandmother held up a hand, silencing him. I wasn't finished. She looked back at David. "What I find most interesting is that in all the years this piano has been in this room, this is the first time I've heard anyone play it with genuine feeling." The room went completely silent. Christopher's mouth fell open and his friends looked confused. David wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "I beg your pardon?" Christopher stammered. Grandma Rose smiled slightly. "I was in the garden room working on my correspondence when I heard music coming from this direction. Not the mechanical, technically correct playing I'm used to hearing from this room, but something with soul, something with heart." She looked directly at David. "Was that you I heard?" David nodded slowly, still not trusting his voice. "Grandma Rose," Christopher protested. "He doesn't even know how to read music. He was just randomly pressing keys, was he?" She raised an eyebrow at her grandson. "Christopher, you've been taking lessons for 8 years. You can play Chopin and Bach flawlessly. You follow every rule, hit every note exactly as written, keep perfect time." She paused. "But tell me, when was the last time your playing made me stop what I was doing and listen?" Christopher's face went red. I don't understand." "Music isn't just about technical skill, sweetheart. It's about communication. It's about taking the emotions in your heart and sharing them with the world. You can teach technique, but you can't teach soul." She looked back at David. "What you played just now, was that a piece you learned somewhere?" "No, ma'am," David said quietly. "It was something I made up." "You composed it yourself?" The interest in her voice was unmistakable. "I write songs sometimes. In my head, mostly. We have an old keyboard at the community center, and I try to play them there when I can." Christopher let out a disbelieving laugh. "Grandma Rose, you can't be serious. He's just making this up." But his grandmother ignored him. "David, what made you want to touch this piano today?" David thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. "It's the most beautiful instrument I've ever seen. And when I heard that first note, it was so perfect and clear. It made me want to see what stories it could tell." "Stories," Grandma Rose repeated softly. "Yes, that's exactly what music is. Stories without words." She was quiet for a long moment, studying David's face. Then she made a decision that shocked everyone in the room. "Play something for me." "What?" Christopher stepped forward. "Grandma Rose, you can't be serious. He shouldn't be touching the piano at all." "Why not?" she asked calmly. "It's my piano, isn't it? I should be able to decide who plays it. The red-haired boy spoke up nervously. But Mrs. Richardson, he doesn't have training or anything. Neither did Mozart when he was 3 years old and started picking out melodies on the harpsichord. Grandma Rose replied dryly. Neither did any of the great composers when they first discovered they had music inside them. She gestured toward the piano bench. Sit down, David. Let me hear what you hear in this instrument. David looked around the room at the three boys staring at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright hostility. Then he looked at Grandma Rose, whose eyes held something he hadn't expected. Genuine curiosity and encouragement. I don't know if I should, he said hesitantly. Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't belong here. Nonsense, Grandma Rose's voice was firm. Music belongs to everyone who loves it. And from what I heard a few minutes ago, you love it very much indeed. She smiled at him. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? You play badly and we all learn something. You play well and we learn something different. Either way, we learn. Christopher was shaking his head vigorously. This is crazy. He could damage the piano. He doesn't know how to touch the keys properly. Christopher, his grandmother said, and there was steel in her voice now. In my 83 years on this earth, I have learned to recognize two types of people. Those who make excuses for why things can't be done, and those who find ways to make beautiful things happen. Which type would you like to be? Christopher fell silent, his face burning with embarrassment and confusion. Grandma Rose turned back to David. The choice is yours, young man. You can let their doubts become your doubts, or you can show them what music really means. But I'll tell you a secret. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. The greatest musicians in history were never the ones who played it safe. David looked at the piano bench, then at the keys that had felt so right under his fingers just minutes before. He thought about all the songs in his head that had never had a proper voice, all the melodies he had hummed while walking to school or lying in bed at night. He thought about Mrs. Johnson at the community center, who had told him that music was a gift that was meant to be shared. And then he thought about his mother, working hard in some other part of this huge house, trusting him to behave himself and not cause trouble. But maybe sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the same as the safe thing to do. Okay, he said quietly, moving toward the piano bench. I'll play something. As he sat down and placed his hands on the keys, he could feel the tension in the room like electricity in the air before a storm. Christopher and his friends were waiting for him to embarrass himself. Grandma Rose was waiting to hear what he had to say, and David was waiting to find out if the magic he had felt before had been real or just his imagination. The piano keys felt cool and smooth under his fingertips. He closed his eyes and tried to block out everything else. The hostile stares, the expensive room, the fear that he was about to make a fool of himself. All that mattered was the music and the story he wanted to tell. He began to play. The first note hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. David's fingers found the keys as if they belonged there, as if the piano had been waiting for him all along. What came next wasn't just music, it was pure emotion transformed into sound. The melody started softly, almost hesitantly, like someone telling a story they weren't sure anyone wanted to hear. But as David's confidence grew, so did the music. His left hand found a gentle rhythm in the bass notes while his right hand wove a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his chest. It wasn't a song anyone in that room had ever heard before, because it didn't exist until that moment. David was creating it as he played, letting his fingers follow the feelings that had been building up inside him for years. The loneliness of being different, the joy of discovering something beautiful, the hope that maybe someday he would find where he belonged. Christopher had been prepared to smirk when David inevitably fumbled or played something childish and simple. But as the music filled the room, his expression changed from smugness to confusion to something that might have been awe. This wasn't the random key pressing he had expected. This was real music. Music that spoke to something deep inside him that he had forgotten existed. The red-haired boy's mouth dropped open. He had been taking violin lessons for 3 years, and he knew enough about music to recognize when something special was happening. The sounds coming from the piano weren't just notes played in sequence. They were connected, flowing together like water, like breath, like something alive. Even the thin boy with glasses, who had been the most vocal in mocking David, found himself leaning forward, drawn in despite himself. He had grown up around classical music, had attended countless concerts with his parents, But he had never heard anything that made him feel the way this simple, improvised melody was making him feel. But it was Grandma Rose's reaction that would have surprised David most if he had been able to see it. Tears were streaming down her cheeks as she listened, not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. She was hearing something she had spent her entire life searching for, the pure, unfiltered voice of musical truth. David's playing grew more confident as the song developed. He added harmonies, experimented with rhythms, let the melody rise and fall like a conversation with an old friend. His fingers seemed to know instinctively which keys to press, which combinations would create the sounds he was hearing in his head. The song told a story without words. It spoke of small apartments and big dreams, of looking through windows at worlds you weren't sure you belonged in, of the way music could make you feel less alone even when everything else in your life was uncertain. It was the sound of hope mixed with longing, of beauty found in unexpected places. As the melody reached its peak, David's playing became more powerful. The piano responded to his touch like it had been waiting years for someone to play it with such passion. The sound filled every corner of the room, spilled out into the hallway, seemed to make the very walls of the mansion vibrate with emotion. Down the hall, David's mother paused in her work. She had been carefully dusting the expensive vases in the living room when she heard the music begin. At first she had been concerned, wondering if David was getting into trouble. But as she listened, she recognized something in the melody that made her heart swell with pride and wonder. That was her son's music, his voice speaking through the piano in ways words never could. Mrs. Richardson, who had been showing Linda the proper way to clean the silver, also stopped what she was doing. She had heard that piano played many times over the years, by music teachers, by students, by professional musicians hired for parties. But she had never heard it sound like this, so alive and full of genuine feeling. Even the household staff began to gather quietly in the hallway, drawn by the extraordinary sounds coming from the music room. The butler, the cook, the gardener who had come in for his lunch break, all of them found themselves standing still, listening to this unexpected concert. Back in the music room, David was completely lost in his playing. The world outside the piano had disappeared. There were no hostile boys, no expensive furniture he wasn't supposed to touch, no worry about whether he belonged in this place. There was only the music and the incredible feeling of finally, fully expressing what was inside his heart. The song began to wind toward its conclusion, but not in a hurried way. David let the melody settle gradually, like the sun setting slowly over the horizon. The powerful moments grew softer, more reflective, but no less beautiful. He added small decorative touches, little musical phrases that sparkled like stars appearing in a darkening sky. When the final note faded away, the silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that comes after something sacred has happened, when people need a moment to process what they have just experienced. David sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the keys, hardly daring to breathe. He had poured everything he had into that song, and now he felt both empty and incredibly full at the same time. He had never played anything like that before, never felt so connected to an instrument or to the music itself. Slowly, he opened his eyes and turned to face the others. What he saw on their faces was the last thing he had expected. Christopher was staring at him with an expression that was part shock, part admiration, and part something that might have been envy. His friends looked equally stunned, as if they had just witnessed something they couldn't quite believe, but it was Grandma Rose's face that took David's breath away. She was openly weeping, not trying to hide her tears or apologize for them. She looked at David as if she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, and what she saw there was something precious and rare. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. David shook his head slowly. "I didn't learn it anywhere. It just came out." Christopher found his voice first among the boys. He struggled for words. "That was incredible. I've never heard anything like it." The red-haired boy nodded eagerly. "It was like you were telling a story, but without any words. I could see pictures in my head while you were playing." "I could feel it," added the thin boy quietly, "like it was coming from inside my own chest." Grandma Rose approached the piano slowly, as if she were approaching something sacred. "David," she said softly, "that was the most beautiful piece of music I have heard in this room in 50 years. And I want you to know that I have heard some very accomplished musicians play this piano. David looked down at his hands, still hardly believing what had just happened. It felt different from the keyboard at the community center, he said. Like the piano was helping me say things I didn't know how to say. That's exactly what the best instruments do, Grandma Rose said. They become partners in the music, not just tools. They help the musician discover things about the music and about themselves that they never knew were there. She placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. Tell me, how long have you been composing music like this? I don't know if I'd call it composing, David said modestly. I just make up songs sometimes. When I'm walking or when I can't sleep. Most of them I just keep in my head. And you've never had formal lessons? Never studied music theory or composition? David shook his head. No, ma'am. My mom works really hard, but piano lessons are expensive. I just play around on the keyboard at the community center when I can. Grandma Rose was quiet for a long moment, and David could see her mind working behind her sharp blue eyes. Finally, she spoke again, and her voice was filled with determination. That, she said firmly, is about to change. 6 months later, David stood backstage at the Metropolitan Arts Center, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. He could hear the murmur of the audience settling into their seats on the other side of the heavy velvet curtains. Tonight was the annual Young Artist Showcase, and for the first time in the event's 15-year history, a 12-year-old was performing as a featured artist. You ready, kiddo? Asked Grandma Rose, who had become so much more than just his piano teacher over the past months. She had become his mentor, his champion, and something like a second grandmother. Tonight she looked elegant in a midnight blue dress, her silver hair gleaming under the backstage lights. David nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he meant it. I think so. What if I forget the piece halfway through? What if my hands shake too much to play? Then you improvise, she said with a smile. You've done it before, remember? Some of the most beautiful music in the world has come from happy accidents and spontaneous moments. David thought back to that first day in the Richardsons' music room, when he had played without thinking, without worrying about making mistakes. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been half a year. So much had changed since then. After hearing David play that day, Grandma Rose had made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She had offered to teach David piano herself, free of charge. She had also arranged for him to have theory lessons with Professor Martinez at the conservatory, and composition lessons with her old friend Dr. Williams. But why? David's mother had asked when Grandma Rose presented the offer. You don't even know us. I know enough, Grandma Rose had replied simply. I know that your son has a gift that comes along maybe once in a generation, and I know that gifts like that are meant to be nurtured, not wasted. The lessons had been challenging in ways David never expected. Learning to read music was like learning a new language, and music theory sometimes made his head spin with all its rules and patterns. But underneath all the technical training, his natural musicality had continued to grow and develop. More importantly, his relationship with Christopher had transformed completely. The boy who had once mocked him for touching the piano had become his closest friend and biggest supporter. Christopher had even started taking composition lessons himself, inspired by David's natural ability to create music from his emotions. I spent so many years playing exactly what was written on the page, Christopher had confided one day during a practice session. I never thought about what I wanted to say through the music. You taught me that music is supposed to mean something. Now, as David waited to perform, he could see Christopher in the audience through a gap in the curtains, sitting next to his parents and giving him an encouraging thumbs up. Next to the Richardson family sat David's mother, wearing a new dress that Grandma Rose had insisted on buying for the occasion. She looked proud and nervous and beautiful, and David felt a surge of love for her that made his chest tight. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of lessons, practice sessions, and small performances. David had played at the conservatory's monthly student recitals, at a few charity events that Grandma Rose had arranged, and even once at the Richardsons' annual garden party. Each time his confidence had grown a little more, but tonight was different. Tonight he would be playing for an audience of music critics, professional musicians, and people from the city's cultural elite. Tonight his performance would determine whether he would receive the scholarship to the prestigious Whitmore Academy that Grandma Rose had helped him audition for. 5 minutes to curtain, called the stage manager. David closed his eyes. and tried to calm his breathing. He thought about the piece he would be playing. Not a classical composition by a famous composer, but an original work he had created over the past 3 months. Grandma Rose had encouraged him to enter the contest with his own music rather than a traditional piece. Anyone can play Chopin, she had said, but only you can play David. The composition was called Windows, and it told the story of his journey over the past months. It began with the gentle, searching melody he had played that first day at the Richardson house, the sound of someone looking through windows at worlds they wondered if they belonged in. But then the music evolved, grew more complex and confident, representing all the learning and growth and friendship that had followed. The middle section was full of joy and energy, with intricate harmonies that represented the excitement of discovering new musical possibilities. And the final section brought all the themes together in a way that spoke of finding home in unexpected places, of dreams that had seemed impossible becoming beautifully real. 2 minutes, called the stage manager. David felt Grandma Rose's hand on his shoulder. Remember, she said softly, you're not playing for them out there. You're playing for the music itself. You're telling its story, letting it speak through you. Everything else is just noise, she paused, then added with a smile. Besides, I'll be right there in the front row. And if anyone in that audience doesn't appreciate what you have to offer, they'll have to answer to me. David laughed despite his nerves. Over the months, he had learned that behind Grandma Rose's elegant exterior was a fierce protector who would fight dragons for the people she cared about. Places, please. David chened to the stage. This was it. David walked through the wings and onto the stage, where a beautiful concert grand piano waited for him under the bright lights. The audience fell silent as he crossed to the piano bench and sat down. He adjusted the bench height, positioned his hands over the keys, and looked out at the sea of faces watching him expectantly. For just a moment, he felt the old fear creeping in. What was he doing here? He was just a kid from the projects whose mother cleaned houses. What right did he have to be on this stage with these sophisticated people? But then his eyes found his mother in the audience, her face glowing with love and pride. He saw Christopher giving him another thumbs up, and Grandma Rose nodding at him with complete confidence in what he was about to do. And suddenly, David understood something important. He wasn't here in spite of where he came from. He was here because of where he came from. His music was beautiful precisely because it came from a real place, from real experiences, from a real heart that had known both struggle and joy. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play Windows. The opening notes filled the concert hall with the same gentle, searching quality that had moved everyone that first day. But now the music was richer, more sophisticated, informed by months of study and practice while still maintaining its essential truth and emotional power. As the piece developed, David felt the familiar sensation of the music taking over, of becoming a conduit for something larger than himself. The piano responded to his touch like an old friend, helping him tell the story he had been born to tell. In the audience, people began to lean forward in their seats. This wasn't what they had expected from a 12-year-old performer. This was mature, sophisticated music with genuine emotional depth. But more than that, it was music that spoke directly to the heart. Music that made them remember why they had fallen in love with music in the first place. When the final notes faded away, the silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. David sat at the piano, his hands still on the keys, wondering if he had somehow disappointed everyone. Then the applause began. It started with one person, then another. Then suddenly the entire audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering with genuine enthusiasm. David looked out at the sea of standing people and felt his heart swell with joy and gratitude. In the front row, his mother was crying happy tears and Grandma Rose was applauding with tears streaming down her face. Christopher was cheering so loudly that his parents had to shush him. As David stood and took his bow, he thought about how much his life had changed since that first day when he had dared to touch the keys of a piano that wasn't meant for him. He had learned that music truly did belong to everyone who loved it, and that the most beautiful songs came not from perfect technique or expensive education, but from an honest heart willing to share its truth with the world. 2 weeks later, David received notification that he had been accepted to the Whitmore Academy with a full scholarship. But even more importantly, he had discovered something about himself and his place in the world that no one could ever take away from him. He belonged wherever his music was welcome. And as it turned out, that was everywhere.